of consciousness are. Here's another example. This is a neurological syndrome known as unilateral spatial neglect. It's fairly commonly observed in patients with certain forms of brain damage. And what happens, why it's known as unilateral spatial neglect, is that these patients seem to be unaware of things that are going on in one portion of their visual field. And it's typically the left portion of the visual field, so that if you take such a patient and you present them with a line, and you say, well, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to draw a mark that exactly divides this line in half, the patient might put it there. Okay? And the reason for that is that they don't see the left portion of this line. They're not paying attention to it. It's not part of their consciousness. They're performing the task as well as they can, but they're neglecting this left portion of the visual field. And yes, it's typically the left portion, okay? And this is associated with damage in the right cerebral hemisphere in these areas here around the junction of the temporal, parietal, and occipital lobe, especially the temporal and parietal lobe. You get damage in the right hemisphere in that particular area, you're very likely to be suffering from unilateral spatial neglect. So again, if you want to identify consciousness with attention and look at some of its correlates, well, its neural correlates, well, you're going to find them. There. Let's look at another one. It's also very common in psychology and cognitive science to identify consciousness with short-term or working memory. I know that those are different, but we're going to treat them as the same term, the same concept for the purposes of this lecture, which is to say, when you're aware of something, when you're conscious of something, a mental representation of that thing is sitting in short-term memory or working memory right at that instant. If the person sitting next to you gives you his telephone number and you can't type it down, then immediately you kind of keep it back in your, keep recycling it in your head. That's the classic short-term memory task. And we know something about the brain structures that are involved in properly functioning working memory. Again, it's areas of the prefrontal cortex and some other areas as well, but mostly in the prefrontal cortex that allow you to engage in working memory tasks at all. Damage to those areas basically wipes out working memory. If you're engaged in a working memory task, those particular areas tend to be activated. So again, if we want to identify consciousness with working memory, which is not a bad idea, okay, we know what some of the neural correlates are of properly functioning working memory. And again, this is the strategy for these kinds of experiments. Okay, let's take another example. Suppose we wanted to identify consciousness with qualia, with the particular unique qualitative state that occurs when you hear something as opposed to see something, or the unique qualitative state that occurs when you see blue as opposed to seeing red or yellow or green or whatever. Well, we know something about the neural correlates of these as well. We know from a host of neurological research going back into the 19th century that seeing something is associated with activity in the occipital lobe. Hearing something is associated with activity in a portion of the temporal lobe. Feeling something is associated with activity in a particular portion of the parietal lobe, and consciously engaging in various voluntary motor activities is associated with activity in a portion of the frontal lobe. So again, this is in a sense a neural correlate of either conscious sensation or conscious voluntary action. And if you want to look at a particular the modality, you can take something like vision and trace the pathway from the retina which generates neural impulses, which are carried along the optic nerve into the lateral geniculate nucleus, and then to various parts of the occipital lobe. Those are, in some sense, the neural correlates of conscious seeing. And if you want to know about the neural correlates of conscious hearing, there's an analogous story. It begins with the eardrum and the auditory nerve and the medial geniculate nucleus and the auditory area in the temporal lobe. Damage in those areas will abolish conscious hearing, especially damage in the auditory area of the temporal lobe, in a way that won't have any effect on conscious seeing. So again, if we identify consciousness with particular qualitative states, the kinds of things that the philosophers talk about when they talk about qualia, we can begin to get a handle on what the neural correlates of those various qualitative states are. A couple more examples. Here is the example of conscious memory. There are patients like the late patient H.M. and other patients like him who have damage to the hippocampus and surrounding structures in the medial portion of the temporal lobe. And by virtue of that damage, these patients lose the ability to consciously remember events that have happened since the time of the brain damage. They don't lose memory entirely, because if you test these patients carefully, you can see evidence of what's known as implicit memory or unconscious memory. You present this patient with a word, and then give them 30 seconds of distraction, ask them what the word was. They say, what word? Who are you? Where am I? Things like that. They have no conscious memory at all of this word. But then, if you then give them an appropriate cue and ask them to generate the first word that comes to mind, they're likely to come up with that stimulus word. That's called a priming effect. We're going to talk about it more later. But for our purposes now, patients like HM who don't have conscious recollection, patients like HM don't have conscious recollection of recent events, but they do have something like unconscious memory for those events. So now, there's an interesting preparation. He doesn't have conscious memory, but he's got unconscious memory. What's going on in his brain? Well, we know that HM's damage was to the hippocampus and to the associated the structures in the medial portion of the temporal lobe. So we can begin to say that, well, the hippocampus is a neural correlate of conscious memory. If you've got an intact functioning hippocampus, you can consciously remember things. If you've got a damaged hippocampus, you can't consciously remember things. Something similar can be said about a phenomenon known as blind sight, studied by Lawrence Weisskranz and his associates in England. These are patients, there is more than one of them, patients with damage to primary visual cortex, maybe not complete damage, but still quite a bit of damage, that causes what the neurologists call a scotoma, a portion of the visual field which simply is blank. The person cannot see anything in some portion of his or her visual field. So we can say that at the very least, that damage to this particular portion of the occipital lobe, area V1, makes the person blind in a particular spot. Well, naturally, V1's the primary visual cortex, right? That's not surprising. What's surprising is that many of these patients are able to identify the presence or absence, the spatial location, and even some of the features of objects presented in their scotoma that they can't consciously see. Okay? So you present an object and you say, what is this object? And the guy says, I can't see anything. You know this, right? And they say, okay, well, just guess. Is there an object in that portion of your visual field or not? His guesses are right more often than you'd expect by chance. Is it moving or stationary? His guesses are right more than you'd expect by chance. Is it big or little? His guesses are right more often than you'd expect by chance. This is known as a distinction between explicit and implicit perception. These patients lack conscious visual perception, but they do have the ability to unconsciously process a visual stimulus, at least to some degree, and to a surprisingly a large degree. So again, if you want to say, what's the neural correlate of conscious perception? You take these blind sight patients who don't have conscious perception, but still are able to operate visually at some level, and you can begin to think about what its neural correlate is. And of course, it's right there in area V1. So again, this is a kind of a neuropsychological strategy for looking at the neural correlates of conscious perception. In fact, Daniel Schachter, a prominent cognitive neuropsychologist now at Harvard University, has suggested that somewhere in the brain, doesn't know exactly where it is, but somewhere in the brain, there's what Schachter called a consciousness module, a portion of the brain that processes conscious mental states in exactly the same way that area V1 processes vision, or the Broca's area processes speech, or Wernicke's area processes language, and that if you somehow disconnect the vision module from this consciousness module, you will get a person who no longer consciously sees, but still things will rattle on inside the visual module and permit various kinds of unconscious visual processing. Now, Schachter actually has pretty much given up this theory at the moment, but I cite it here only as an example of how you might go on and look for the neural correlates of consciousness using this particular kind of psychological module. Turning from brain damage to brain imaging, it might be possible to identify the neural correlates of particular intentional states. Remember, in the language that we're using now, intentional state means a conscious state that is about something. When I see you, I'm looking at a classroom, okay? There's an object out here that my neural state is about. So it might actually be possible to use, say, fMRI, the brain imaging. These are PET images, just because they're easy to think about in this context. It might be possible to use something like fMRI to identify what pattern of neural activity is associated with thinking a particular kind of thought or feeling a particular kind of emotion. This work, in fact, is from Hannah Damasio, and what she did simply was, a long time ago now, recorded PET images of brain activity when subjects were asked to perceive particular objects presented in a visual modality. And what you see here is a lot of activity in the posterior portion of the cortex. And then on another set of trials, she asked them to remember particular events. Remember your first date or your first kiss or something like that. And what you get is a lot of activity in the temporal lobes surrounding the hippocampus. When she asked her subjects to feel particular emotions, pleasant emotions or unpleasant emotions, she got activity in a very different area of cerebral cortex. And when she asked them to think about wanting something or wanting to avoid something, some kind of motivational state, she got activation in quite different areas. So this is wanting